Ever get the feeling like when you stumble on something new and you think, wait, how have I never heard of this before?
Oh, absolutely. Like finding out there's a whole other section in the library you never knew existed.
Right, and it's full of these incredible stories just waiting to be discovered. Well, today's deep dive is about one of those, the Kurds.
And it's a big one. I mean, we're talking potentially the largest population in the world, like on par with a whole country that doesn't have a country of their own.
Okay, now that's a head scratcher. It's hard to even imagine that many people, all connected by this shared identity, but scattered across the globe. How is that even possible?
Yeah, the estimates are all over the place, but we're talking anywhere from 30 to, get this, 50 million people. This stateless nation, the Kurds, mostly concentrated in a region they call Kurdistan.
Kurdistan. So before we get into the why don't they have a country part, let's back up. Who are the Kurds? What makes them a distinct group?
Their story goes way, way back, like way before your average history book. Think 4,000 years, maybe even more. With roots in ancient Mesopotamia, their identity is this fascinating mix of language, culture, and a shared history full of, ups and downs.
4,000 years is a long time to maintain a sense of us without a unified homeland. What's the glue holding them together after all this time?
Well, language is huge. It's not as simple as saying all Kurds speak the same Kurdish, though. Over centuries, you get different dialects, and sadly, because of politics, they haven't always been able to speak or learn their language freely, which is just...
It's like their language itself has become part of their fight for recognition. That's really powerful. What about their culture? Anything that stands out?
Culturally, they're fascinating. One thing that really struck me is their emphasis on gender equality. Now, we're talking a predominantly Sunni Muslim population, but Kurdish women have historically had major roles, even in armed resistance, which you don't see everywhere in that region.
Wow, that's really interesting. It speaks to a cultural fabric that's quite different. Speaking of different, I have to ask about this peacock angel god I read about. That definitely piqued my interest.
Ah, you're talking about Yazidism. It's an ancient religion woven into Kurdish tradition, and yeah, their god, Melekuis, is often depicted as a peacock angel. Unfortunately, their beliefs have also made them targets of persecution throughout history, which, yeah, adds another layer of complexity to their story.
We've only just scratched the surface here, but it's already clear. The Kurds are a people with a rich and layered history. But the question that keeps nagging at me is, with all this history, going back thousands of years, why don't they have a country of their own?
Now that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to understand that, we have to look at how their story intersects with centuries of broken promises and constantly shifting borders.
It does feel kind of, I don't know, unfair. This group with such a long history, so many people connected in all these ways, but without that place to call their own, it's a lot to wrap your head around. So where do we even begin to untangle how this happened?
Yeah, no, it's a long and winding road, that's for sure. But it's crucial to understanding the Kurds today. You really can't separate them from all the outside forces that have shaped their destiny, really. For a huge chunk of time, we're talking centuries, the Kurdish region was part of the Ottoman Empire.
And not just a blip on the radar, right? We're talking nearly 400 years under Ottoman rule. That has to have left its mark.
Absolutely. And early on, it wasn't necessarily a recipe for conflict. Kurdish leaders within the empire actually had a good amount of autonomy. Ottomans had a more, I guess you could say, hands-off approach back then. But then, as we get into the 1800s, things start to shift.
What changed?
Well, the Ottoman Empire itself was facing its own internal struggles. You have the rise of nationalism, and they felt the need to, centralize their power. And part of that meant cracking down on that Kurdish autonomy, trying to exert more control over the region. That's where you really start to see those early seeds of Kurdish resistance taking root.
So the more the Ottomans tried to clamp down, the more it fueled that desire for, self-determination.
Exactly. And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, World War I explodes onto the scene and, it changes everything.
This is where those history flashbacks to the Sykes-Picot Agreement come in, right? The one that always seemed kind of shady.
Shady? Maybe. But definitely impactful. Imagine taking a map of the Middle East, right? And then picture these British and French diplomats basically carving it up with a ruler, deciding who gets what from the fallen Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
That, in a nutshell, was Sykes-Picot.
And the Kurds, they were just, were they even at the table for these discussions?
Sadly, not really. And even though they were initially promised an independent state in the Treaty of Sèvres, that was short-lived. Turkish nationalism was surging, they weren't having it, and bam, another war breaks out, redraws the map yet again. Just like that, the dream of a unified Kurdistan was gone.
So instead of one nation, the Kurdish people were divided, scattered across all these newly drawn borders.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine that, the feeling of, I don't know, betrayal almost.
Mhm.
Instead of one Kurdistan, you have this region divided between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, even bits and pieces ending up in Armenia and Azerbaijan.
It's crazy how just drawing lines on a map can have such huge, long-lasting consequences. So instead of one shared Kurdish experience, you've got these separate populations, each dealing with their own set of challenges.
That's the heart of it, really. It's what makes understanding the Kurds today so complex.
It's kind of overwhelming when you really think about it.
It is.
All these different Kurdish populations spread out across countries that, haven't exactly been known for their tolerance of diversity, let's say.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act for them, to say the least.
Trying to hold on to their identity while navigating these political minefields, basically. So where do we even start to unpack all of this? Turkey seems like a logical place, since they've got the largest Kurdish population, right?
Yeah, Turkey's a good example of just how tangled this whole thing gets.
Because,
Well, you got to remember, Turkish national identity is really tied up with this legacy of the Ottoman Empire.
right, the Ottomans, who, as we just discussed, ruled over the Kurds for centuries.
Exactly. So from their perspective, the idea of an independent Kurdistan within their borders, it's seen as a threat, plain and simple.
So it's like this clash of national narratives playing out, each side with their own claim to the same land.
Exactly. And that clash has fueled decades of conflict, most notably with the PKK.
The Kurdistan Workers' Party, right. They're the ones who have been fighting for autonomy in Turkey.
Right, since the 80s, actually.
Mm.
But they're also considered a terrorist organization by a lot of countries, so it's this whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where you can understand the desire for self-determination, but the violence makes it really tough.
It's a tough one, for sure.
So how does that compare to, say, Iraq? They've got that Kurdish autonomous region, right? Which at least sounds like a step in a more, I don't know, hopeful direction.
Yeah, in some ways, it is a bit more hopeful, relatively speaking. See, after the first Gulf War, the Kurds in Iraq, they managed to set up this, de facto autonomous region up in the north.
So they were basically governing themselves, just not officially.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then after Saddam Hussein was overthrown, it became official. They wrote it into the Iraqi constitution.
So they've got their own parliament, their own government. And I remember reading about the Peshmerga, the Kurdish fighting force. Weren't they instrumental in the fight against ISIS?
Oh, absolutely. The Peshmerga were on the front lines pushing back against ISIS, and they were some of the most effective fighters out there. Really earned a lot of respect for their courage.
Okay, so they've got their own region, they're fighting off ISIS, gaining international recognition. It kind of begs the question, why not just go for full independence at that point?
Well, they did try. Back in 2017, Masoud Barzani, he was the president of the Kurdistan regional government at the time, he held an independence referendum.
How'd that go?
Overwhelmingly, people voted yes. But there was a slight problem.
I have a feeling I know what's coming.
The Iraqi government, along with Iran and Turkey, were not exactly thrilled, to put it mildly. They saw it as a dangerous precedent, so they basically said, nice try, but no way.
So it's like every time the Kurds get close, something or someone swoops in to shut it down.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme, unfortunately.
So we've covered Turkey, Iraq. What about Iran?
Well, the Kurdish population in Iran is smaller than in those other countries, and their situation is a bit more, well, under the radar, I guess you could say.
Meaning?
Meaning there are definitely tensions there. Groups like the KDPI, the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, and PJK, they've been fighting the Iranian government for years, but it doesn't get as much attention.
Okay, so kind of a similar story, just less visible. And then there's Syria, which from what I understand is where things get really messy.
Oh yeah, Syria's a whole other ballgame. The civil war there just threw everything into chaos, and when the Syrian government was busy fighting other rebel groups, the Kurds saw an opportunity.
And they went for it.
They did. They carved out their own autonomous region in the north, which they called Rojava.
And this is where the YPG and YPJ come in, right? The Kurdish male and female defense units that were fighting ISIS?
That's right. They were incredibly effective, especially considering they often had very little support.
Which makes what happened next all the more, well, I don't know what the word is, frustrating, infuriating.
I hear you. It's hard to wrap your head around. The U.S. was allied with the Kurds in Syria, helping them fight ISIS.
Mm.
And then...
And then Trump pulled the rug out from under them?
Pretty much. The U.S. withdrew their troops, leaving the Kurds incredibly vulnerable to a Turkish offensive.
It's no wonder people call it a betrayal.
It was a huge blow. They were forced to make a deal with the Syrian government, the same government they'd been fighting, just to survive.
It's like every time you think things can't get more complicated.
Right. And then you throw the war in Ukraine into the mix.
Which has thrown the entire geopolitical landscape into a tailspin. So, where does that leave things? What does the future hold for the Kurds?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's left to say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has definitely shifted their focus and resources, which means they've got less influence in the Middle East.
Creating a vacuum that other players, like Turkey, are all too eager to fill. Which doesn't bode well for the Kurds.
Not really. Turkey's feeling emboldened, and they're using this to their advantage. They've even been pressuring Sweden and Finland, who are trying to join NATO, to cut back on their support for the Kurds.
So it's this whole tangled web, but with the Kurds caught in the middle, as always.
Yeah.
If we had to distill all of this, all this history, all this complexity, what's the takeaway?
The Kurds are a people with an incredibly long, incredibly rich history, a unique culture, who have been denied self-determination time and time again. Their fate is constantly being decided by global powers, and they're always caught in the crossfire.
It's a lot to process, but it's a story that deserves our attention. It reminds us that, this quest for identity, for belonging, for a place to truly call home, it's something that resonates with everyone, no matter who you are or where you come from.
Well said.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, and a huge thanks to our expert for shedding light on this incredibly complex and important topic. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a corner of the world you might not know as well as you think. Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those curious minds engaged.